I took the hat off for this one. Let loose my glorious locks. So, I mentioned that I would be doing a couple other videos, and one of them would be about character kicking. And this is exactly that. And you'll forgive me, I have a script somewhat. To start off, make sure we're all on the same level as to what character kicking actually is, which is just, I would define it as making a character's situation worse in any way. So, losing their car keys is kicking them, as is ripping their face off and ramming it down their esophagus. That's kicking them. Fundamentally, it's a good thing. Like, if everyone was peachy, then that would be great in reality, but it would be kind of shitty for fiction, because you wouldn't have any stories really, because conflict is what makes them. The question is at what point it becomes too much. Now, George R.R. Martin of Song of Fire and Ice fame, Ice and Fire. I don't know why it's Ice and Fire, not Fire and Ice. Fire and Ice flows better. Like, I hear people correct themselves because they say it's Fire and Ice. He's made a bit of a career out of killing characters at random and, generally making their lives bad. I haven't read A Song of Ice and Fire. I was going to, but the price of importing the, translated copies from Iceland, it was a bit much, and I just can't be asked to read it in English because I feel like it's... But my understanding is that the characters don't just stand there, like in a bad horror film, and just wait to get murdered. They have things that they want, they have things which they want to do, and they try to do those things. They spend their entire time, conniving and manoeuvring to get their lot in life above everyone else, whether that involves dragons or dwarves or whatever the fuck. I don't know. Yeah, so the characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, they have agency, which is sometimes what gets them killed. They're interesting as characters because they have lives beyond getting killed. Like, when people try to copy what Martin has done with A Song of Ice and Fire, they tend to just come up with big casts of characters and then indiscriminately murder them, which is not the same thing. It's a kind of a reduction of what he's actually doing, which is he's coming up with a complicated cast of characters, all of whom have their own motives, and all of them have their own starting situations, and then letting it play out naturally, as naturally as it would be, and it naturally, in as much as fiction can be natural, leads to some of them dying in particularly brutal ways. It's not killing them deliberately as a result of the story, rather than killing them to make the story. To draw a parallel with my own work, because I'm allowed to, one of the main characters, arguably the main character, I'm not quite sure where she stands, gets kicked out of her home by her father, which is a pretty shitty thing to happen. The thing is, though, rather than simply being kicked out of the house by her father because her father's an asshole, she gets kicked out of her home because she punched a student in the face so hard that said student ends up with stitches. That's, all of a sudden that's slightly more justifiable. On its own, simply laying a motherfucker out, maybe an overreaction to kick the person out, arguably. But when you consider that that is itself a culmination of a shit ton of general arguments and disagreements and problems with the two of them, it becomes slightly more reasonable. Basically, she gets kicked out of the house because she's a little shit, not because her father's an asshole. She's still the main character, or one of the main characters, a deuteragonist, and she's still intended to be sympathetic. Her reasoning for laying that bitch out is completely reasonable, and that's hopefully what makes her separate from generic abused main character 2000. I wrote down a really facetious number and I forgot it. You can't really read it off, it doesn't have the same effect. Generic abused main character 2000, 10,000 2,010,321. Which is to say that she's as much to blame for her results as her father is. She's as much to blame for being kicked out as her father is. It's kind of the same thing with A Song of Fire and Ice. If someone gets stabbed in the face by somebody else, they are to blame for them getting stabbed in the face because they put themselves in a situation where they made the enemy, and the enemy is to blame because, well, the enemy stabbed them. They're both to blame. Not equally to blame, but they are both to blame. The enemy who stabs them didn't just stab them because they're an asshole, they stabbed them because, of the actions of both of them. They compound and they result in the death of a character. I'm going to quote a character from a brilliant one of... I have no idea how to pronounce this. I'm going to assume it's Lim Yile, who is an author who's been ranting about things in fantasy books for the better half of 10 years, more than 10 years. It's actually about exactly 10 years. And does so brilliantly. And, despite this being intended at fantasy, it does ring true for pretty much everything. So, I'm going to read this aloud. Abuse shoots the characterization of other people all to hell. There are the bullies, of course, and the parents. With the exception of very few authors, I no longer read fantasy books where the main characters are teenagers, because I'd like to at least imagine that all the characters are complex and real people. Glasses push up. And the author doesn't allow me to imagine that about the teenagers' parents. They are horrible, horrible, horrible. And it's the narrative, not the character, that's selling it. There's a reason that I am not a fan of the omniscient voice. The characters that are created only to watch the scenery and have no thoughts or personalities of their own, or narrators whose perceptions are identical to reality, aka canon Mary Seuss. When I start reading a book, I take the viewpoint character as the hero automatically, or my favourite of the viewpoint characters. It really doesn't matter if someone else is supposed to be more important to the story. My reading mind doesn't work that way. It'll transform the viewpoint character into the hero if necessary. The person whose thoughts I'm sharing is the important one, and I naturally assume intriguing, complex, fallible. If for some reason I can't bond with the viewpoint character, I try a minor one, and if that doesn't succeed, I put the book down. But there has to be, for me at least, some doubt. That things might look a certain way to a certain character, but they need not actually be so. That's kind of slightly skewing the topic, which is to say that you often get characters which are written to be uncharacterized, just, I suppose, antagonists, but antagonists kind of suggest some degree of characterization. Characters which exist merely to be assholes, and they don't have anything beyond that. And there's no nuance either. They are assholes, and that's how it is. That's like the fact of the universe, is that this person is an asshole, guaranteed. This is kind of bad, because, well, it's okay for a character, if it's first person and you're inside the character's head, it's okay for the character to think that guy's an asshole and never waver from that viewpoint. But if you're outside a character's head, if you're in a third person narrator, then you expect some degree of objectivity. Describing characters as particularly malevolent is stepping maybe over the bounds. You want to keep things kind of, I keep saying objective. I think that's probably the best thing. The important thing, as with everything, is to make sure that the characters involved are believable characters. The people who are on the receiving end of being kicked or being abused or whatever, they might be completely and totally innocent in, they might have done nothing to the person in question. That happens, but they need to have a purpose in the plot, which is not just having a smackdown laid upon them constantly. If they exist only as to be a punching bag, I think something's gone wrong. Similarly, people doing the kicking / abusing they need to have some purpose and characterization beyond simply being the person who does that. Antagonists need a motivation. They always do. Admittedly, some motivations are kind of crap. If you look at like fucking Skyrim, Alduin's motivation is pretty much raw, I'm a dragon, which is a naff motivation, but who plays the Elder Scrolls for the writing? At least, if you do, you should have stopped about the time the last expansion pack from Morrowind came out. Voldemort had a pretty concrete motivation. It's a bit, it's a bit generic. More I'm evil. The whole genocide the Muggle world thing, but it was very concrete and it was explained, and the reader didn't agree with Voldemort, but they could at least, hopefully, see why he felt like he did. And I can't remember why he felt like he did, because it has been a spectacularly long time since I read Harry Potter, but I'm pretty sure it was something to do with the relationship with his father. So, yeah, even Voldemort had a pretty concrete motivation, and that's kind of the gold standard, is to have antagonists who have a reason for doing what they're doing, rather than simply just being the person who punches the main character, and to also have the main character be someone who is more than just the person who gets punched by the antagonist. I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully something has gotten through. Once again, there will be a little Pac-Man, a little excerpt in the outro. So, enjoy. I don't even. That was meant to be vaguely French, but I don't think an enjoy is a French-rooted word. Genis.